Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my great friends, Senator Booker and Senator Bennett, for their really passionate, moving remarks about the task ahead of us to make sure that as we reauthorize No Child Left Behind, as we reorder our priorities, that we remember that this law is an education reform law, but it has to be a civil rights law as well. Has to make sure that in the best traditions of this country that we are requiring that every single child gets a quality education. And I want to talk about my amendment that is co-sponsored by Senators Booker and Warren, Coons, Durbin, Mikulski, and others. And I want to start by telling a story that is unfortunately not unfamiliar in probably every corner of this country. I'm going to talk about a 16-year-old African-American boy, an 8th grader, in an urban middle school in Connecticut, and I'll call him James for today's purposes. James had a habit of walking out of class in the middle of instruction, and he'd walk out of class and he'd wander the hallways until he'd eventually run into a teacher, an administrator, a school resource officer who would haul him down to the principal's office. His grandmother, who was his primary caregiver, would get a phone call. She'd come pick him up, and then the suspension proceedings would start. James would get suspended for a few days. He'd come back, and the whole cycle would play out again, such that by the middle of his first semester of his 8th grade year, he had been out of school, suspended, more days than he had been in school. And one day, he was so frustrated when an assistant principal stopped him once again as he was wandering the halls that he had an argument. He was a big kid for his age, but he was a total teddy bear. He never hurt anybody. But that day, when he talked back to that assistant principal, they called the police, and James got arrested. Now he's got a criminal record. But the reason why he was walking out of class day after day, week after week, was pretty simple. James was an 8th grader who couldn't read. Couldn't read. He could barely read. And so he had this toxic mixture of frustration and embarrassment every day that he sat in class, such that it had no relevance to him, and he walked out. And the worst of it is that the school knew that he couldn't read because he had an identified learning disability. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a secret. And yet James got promoted year after year because it was just easier to pass him along, easier to push him out as the suspensions and eventual arrest were on its way to doing, rather than actually give James an education. Now, I only know this story because my wife, who was then a legal aid lawyer in Connecticut, represented James. And his grandmother, who just wanted James to get a decent education, would call my wife in tears every time that James was found in the hallways and suspended again and again. Now, my wife actually got the services that James needed, but James's story is not unique. And most kids don't have legal aid lawyers fighting on their behalf. Most kids in James' situation have the deck stacked against them. Disabled kids who are hard to teach, poor kids who are warehoused in failing schools, Black and Hispanic kids struggling to overcome generations of discrimination. And they don't all have lawyers. They have us, the United States Congress. This place, Washington, D.C., has had its finest moments when it stands up for educational civil rights. The idea that a child in this country should get a quality education no matter their race or their address or their disability. And whether we like it or not, there are these political pressures in America that cause minority kids and disabled kids and poor kids to get an education that is not equal to that of their white or non-disabled or more affluent peers. And the facts are just really stubborn here. And I can't say them any better than Senator Bennett did earlier today. Today, half of African-American and Latino 4th grade students score below the basic level of reading that we expect of our students. Just 1 out of every 7 African-American 8th grade students scores at a basic proficiency level in math. And nationally, 70% of students who attend high schools with low graduation rates come from low-income families. And these statistics, they represent a stain on the conscience of our nation. And if this body wants to stay true to its history of standing up for educational civil rights, then we've got to make a stand this week to make sure that this Every Child Achieves Act ensures that minority and poor and disabled kids get a fair shot at a good education. Now, right now, Mr. President, this bill doesn't meet this test. And that's why the nation's leading civil rights organizations, from the NAACP to La Raza to the Urban League, oppose this bill in its current form. And it's why they've joined together with business groups who want to make sure that our educational system stays competitive for everyone, to propose a fairly simple problem to a problem that is also propose a simple solution to a problem that is also fairly simple. So this bill requires that schools continue to assess student performance while getting rid of these annual high-stakes tests that was unquestionably bad for schools and for students. No Child Left Behind was a bad bill for my state and for the nation, so I'm glad that Senator Murray and Senator Alexander have come together to create something better for our kids. The bill requires that states track results by what we call subgroups: minority students, disabled students, poor students, and non-English speaking students. But the problem is this: when schools are failing, or when minority or disabled students are falling way behind their peers, the bill doesn't require or even ask states or school districts to do anything to fix it. Nothing. Now, as a civil rights matter, that's unacceptable. Now, No Child Left Behind said a lot on this issue, and most of it wasn't helpful or productive. NCLB made the measurement of schools and subgroups a test, and only a test. NCLB prescribed in a detailed way what schools had to do to turn around student outcomes. And NCLB punished schools that didn't turn around those outcomes quickly enough. So we've learned a lot from that backwards approach, from this Washington knows best attitude. And so that's why the amendment that we're offering today takes a very different approach to accountability for vulnerable kids. Under our amendment, states are required to identify the bottom 5% of performing schools according to their measurement of performance. They've got to identify the dropout factories, the high schools where less than 2/3 of the students are graduating. And then they've got to identify, again, according to their own measurement, schools where subgroups of students, low-income students, students of color, students with disabilities, English learners, aren't meeting their own set of criteria. And this amendment ensures that schools are identified based on a measurement that's set by the state, not by Washington. And it has to include multiple measures, not just that test score alone. Let me say that again. The measurement is determined by the state, and it cannot be based on test scores alone. Then the amendment says that once you've identified those schools or those student groups that are in need of improvement, according to your own measurements, then the state needs to come up with a plan to improve outcomes. Period, stop. Identify your achievement gaps according to your own comprehensive measurements, come up with a plan to fix the gaps. No federally dictated measurement, no federally set intervention, no federal penalty if you don't succeed. Just identify your problems and come up with a plan to make the problems better. The accountability then will happen naturally, as students and parents and community members have input into that plan and the ability to watch to see if it's working. Local solutions, local oversight, local accountability. Now, in 2006, as a candidate for Congress, I excoriated No Child Left Behind wherever I went. I come from a family of teachers. I married a former teacher. Now I have 2 kids, one in the public school system and one on his way there. And I watched firsthand as NCLB failed teachers and parents and students. But about a month or so after I was sworn into the House of Representatives in 2007, I received a visit from the Children's Defense Fund. They had heard how vocal I was in my criticism of the law. And they just wanted me to know that not every state was like Connecticut. They told me stories of places where prior to NCLB, kids with disabilities were sent for half the day for, quote, vocational training, unquote, with the janitor. Nothing was expected of these kids. And more often than not, these kids lived up to the low expectations that were set for them. So maybe the only redeeming quality of No Child Left Behind was that it did expose these inexcusable gaps in performance between disabled and non-disabled kids. It forced states to talk about why black students year after year were 30% behind their white peer students in achievement tests. It caused embarrassment for school systems with schools where the majority of kids got so little out of school that they dropped out before graduation. And it put pressure on all of us to do better. Mr. President, this is an education bill, but it's not a worthwhile bill unless it's also a civil rights bill. Every single child, no matter their race or their geography, their income or their disability, deserves a first-rate education. So I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this vital amendment that continues our march away from the stringent, inflexible requirements of No Child Left Behind while ensuring that all of our students receive the support they need to be successful. I yield the floor.